Christ consciousness isn't New Age, it's original. What if I told you that the deepest spiritual teachings being dismissed today as New Age nonsense are actually the most ancient wisdom humanity has ever known? That the consciousness being sought in meditation retreats and self-help seminars was taught 2,000 years ago by a Jewish mystic in the hills of Palestine. Today we're going to explore something that's been hidden in plain sight for centuries. Christ consciousness isn't some modern spiritual trend invented by crystal-wielding yogis. It's the original teaching, the heart of what Jesus actually came to share with humanity. And it's been buried under centuries of institutional dogma, political manipulation, and deliberate misinterpretation. But here's what's fascinating. Modern psychology, particularly the work of Carl Jung, has rediscovered these same truths through an entirely different pathway. The integration of the conscious and unconscious mind that Jung called individuation is remarkably similar to what the Essenes called the way of the awakened heart. So buckle up, because we're about to dive deep into the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern psychology, exploring how these timeless teachings can transform your life in ways that feel both revolutionary and deeply familiar. The historical context. Let's start with what we actually know, not what we've been told to believe. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy throwing stones into caves near the Dead Sea accidentally made one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed the existence of a Jewish sect called the Essenes, who lived in communities throughout Palestine from about 200 BCE to 100 CE. These weren't your typical religious folks. The Essenes were mystics, healers, and scholars who had developed sophisticated practices for what they called the purification of consciousness. They believed that every human being contained within them a divine spark, what they referred to as the light of the world, that could be awakened through specific practices and ways of living. Here's where it gets interesting. Jesus' teachings, when you strip away the later theological additions, align almost perfectly with Essene philosophy. The emphasis on inner purification, the rejection of material wealth, the focus on healing, the concept of universal love. These weren't revolutionary new ideas. They were the culmination of centuries of Jewish mystical tradition. But here's what the institutional church didn't want you to know. The Essenes taught that this divine consciousness wasn't exclusive to one person. It was the birthright of every human being. Jesus wasn't special because he was the only Son of God. He was special because he fully realized what we all have the potential to become. The Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945 as part of the Nag Hammadi Library, preserves some of these original teachings. Jesus says, "I am the light that shines over all things. I am everything. Everything came forth from me, and everything reached me. Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift a stone, and you will find me there." This isn't the language of exclusive divinity. It's the language of universal consciousness. The psychology of transformation. Now, let's jump forward about 1,900 years to Switzerland, where Carl Jung was having what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. Jung, through his work with patients and his own psychological crisis, discovered something remarkable. The human psyche contains within it archetypal patterns that transcend individual experience. Jung identified what he called the self with a capital S, not the ego self we identify with day to day, but the deeper integrated totality of conscious and unconscious elements within us. The process of realizing this self he called individuation, becoming who you truly are, beyond the masks and conditioning of society. But here's what Jung himself recognized. This process of individuation was remarkably similar to the mystical traditions he studied, including Christian mysticism. In his work Answer to Job, Jung wrote extensively about the psychological significance of the Christ figure as a symbol of the individuated self. Think about it. Jung's concept of the shadow, the repressed, denied aspects of the personality, mirrors perfectly the ancient teaching of confronting and integrating our darkness to find our light. His idea of the anima and animus, The contrasexual aspects of the psyche that must be integrated echoes the mystical marriage spoken of in Gnostic texts. The difference is that Jung approached these truths through the lens of psychology, while the ancient mystics approached them through the lens of spirituality. But they were pointing to the same fundamental transformation of consciousness. What both traditions understood is this: most human suffering comes from identification with the ego mind, the chattering voice in your head that never stops judging, comparing, worrying, and wanting. True peace, true joy, true love emerges when you learn to identify with something deeper, what Jung called the self, what the mystics called Christ consciousness. The Essene practices. So what did this actually look like in practice? How did the Essenes cultivate this awakened consciousness? First, they understood something that modern neuroscience is just rediscovering: the intimate connection between mind and body. The Essenes practiced what they called the communion with the angels, not literal winged beings, but the natural forces that govern physical and psychological health. They had an angel of earth practice that involved connecting barefoot with the ground, understanding that the Earth's electromagnetic field actually helps regulate our nervous system. Modern science calls this grounding or earthing, and research shows it reduces inflammation, improves sleep, and balances cortisol levels. They had an angel of water practice that wasn't just about physical cleansing, but about the psychological purification that comes from ritual bathing and conscious hydration. They understood that water carries vibration and intention, something that modern researchers like Masaru Emoto have begun to explore scientifically. But perhaps most importantly, they practiced what we would now call mindfulness meditation. They called it the communion with the angel of peace. This involved sitting in silence, observing the movements of the mind without attachment, and cultivating what they described as the peace that passeth understanding. The Dead Sea Scrolls describe specific techniques: watching the breath, observing thoughts without judgment, and cultivating a sense of loving presence that extended to all beings. Sound familiar? It should. These are exactly the techniques that modern mindfulness-based therapies have shown to be effective for everything from depression and anxiety to chronic pain and addiction. The Essenes also practiced what they called the therapy of the word, using specific phrases and affirmations to reprogram limiting beliefs and connect with higher states of consciousness. They understood that language shapes reality, that the words we speak to ourselves become the world we experience. But here's what made their approach different from modern positive psychology. They grounded these practices in a deep understanding of service to others. They believed that individual awakening was meaningless unless it led to greater compassion and service to the community. Jung's active imagination. Jung discovered a parallel practice that he called active imagination, a method of consciously dialoguing with the unconscious mind through visualization, journaling, and artistic expression. What Jung found was that when people learned to consciously engage with their inner symbolic world, profound healing and transformation occurred. This wasn't just therapy, it was a form of spiritual practice. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." He understood that beneath our neuroses and conditioning lies an authentic self that is connected to something much larger than our individual ego. Jung's process of active imagination involved several steps that mirror ancient mystical practices. First, creating sacred space, setting aside time and physical space for inner work, just as the Essenes created physical communities dedicated to spiritual practice. Second, cultivating receptivity, learning to quiet the rational, controlling mind and become open to whatever arises from the unconscious, similar to the mystical practice of surrender or letting go and letting God. Third, engaging with symbols, rather than analyzing or dismissing the images and feelings that arise, learning to dialogue with them as if they were living beings with their own wisdom to share. And finally, integration, taking the insights from these inner encounters and embodying them in daily life through changed behavior, relationships, and ways of being in the world. Jung found that people who engaged seriously with this process often reported experiences that could only be described as spiritual, moments of profound peace, universal love, and connection to something sacred. He called these numinous experiences, and he believed they were essential for psychological health. What Jung realized, and what the ancient mystics knew, is that the psyche is not contained within the individual. We are connected to what Jung called the collective unconscious, a field of shared archetypal wisdom that transcends individual experience. Modern quantum physicists are beginning to explore similar concepts about the interconnected nature of consciousness itself. The shadow and the light. But here's where both Jung and the ancient teachings get really practical. They understood that you cannot experience authentic light without first acknowledging and integrating your shadow. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is everything about yourself that you've denied, repressed, or projected onto others. It's your anger, your selfishness, your fear, your sexuality, your need for power, all the parts of human nature that nice people aren't supposed to have. The Essenes called this the dark night of the soul, the necessary process of confronting and accepting the totality of who you are. They understood that spiritual bypassing, trying to jump straight to love and light without doing the difficult work of shadow integration, only creates more unconscious suffering. Jesus himself went through this process. The story of his temptation in the wilderness isn't about literal devils. It's a symbolic representation of confronting the shadow aspects of power, pride, and material desire. Only after this confrontation could he emerge with the authority to teach about love and forgiveness. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." He understood that our unconscious shadow gets projected onto others, creating the very conflicts and judgments that separate us from the love we seek. The practical implication is this: every time you find yourself triggered by someone else, every time you feel intense anger, judgment, or revulsion toward another person, you're being shown an aspect of your own shadow that needs integration. This is why Jesus taught, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye?" He wasn't being moralistic, he was teaching practical psychology. The things that most disturb us about others are usually the things we most need to accept about ourselves. But here's the beautiful thing: when you stop running from your shadow and learn to embrace it with compassion, something miraculous happens. The energy that was tied up in repression and projection becomes available for creativity, authentic relationship, and genuine service to others. Jung called this the transcendent function, the psychological process by which opposing elements within the psyche are brought into creative tension, resulting in a new level of consciousness that transcends both. Practical integration for modern life. So how do you actually live this? How do you move from understanding these concepts intellectually to embodying them in your daily life? First, develop what the Essenes called the practice of presence. This means learning to inhabit your body fully, to feel your feet on the ground, to breathe consciously, to notice the aliveness that exists in this moment. Most of our suffering comes from living in mental projections about the past or future. Presence is the antidote. Start with 5 minutes a day. Sit quietly, close your eyes, and simply notice what's happening in your body and mind without trying to change anything. This isn't about achieving some special state. It's about developing the capacity to witness your experience without being overwhelmed by it. Second, practice what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of trying to resolve every conflict or contradiction in your life, learn to sit with paradox. You can be both strong and vulnerable, both confident and uncertain, both loving and angry. The goal isn't to eliminate difficult emotions, it's to expand your capacity to contain them without acting unconsciously. Third, develop a practice of conscious dialogue with your inner world. Keep a journal and write from different perspectives within yourself. What does your anger want you to know? What is your fear trying to protect? What is your joy calling you toward? This is how you begin to integrate the shadow and access the wisdom of your unconscious mind. Fourth, pay attention to synchronicities, the meaningful coincidences that seem to occur when you're aligned with your deeper purpose. Jung saw synchronicities as evidence of the connection between inner psychological states and outer events. The more conscious you become, the more these meaningful connections tend to appear. And finally, remember that this work is not about perfecting yourself or becoming some idealized version of who you think you should be. It's about becoming more fully who you already are beneath all the conditioning and protective strategies you've developed. The Christ consciousness that Jesus embodied and that Jung pointed towards psychologically is not some rarefied state reserved for special people. It's your natural birthright, the love, wisdom, and peace that emerge when you stop identifying exclusively with your ego mind and remember your deeper nature. Living the teaching. Here's what I want you to understand. This isn't theoretical knowledge meant to impress people at dinner parties. This is practical wisdom for transforming your actual lived experience. When you wake up tomorrow morning, before you check your phone or start planning your day, spend 2 minutes feeling grateful for the simple fact that you're alive. This gratitude isn't positive thinking. It's recognition of the mysterious gift of consciousness itself. When someone triggers your anger or judgment during the day, instead of immediately reacting or suppressing the feeling, pause and ask, what is this person showing me about myself that I need to see? This doesn't mean becoming a doormat. It means responding from consciousness rather than reactivity. When you feel overwhelmed by the challenges of life, remember that the same consciousness that animated Jesus, that inspired Jung's discoveries, that guided the Essene mystics, is alive within you right now. You don't need to earn it or achieve it. You need to remember it. The practical fruit of this remembering is what the ancients called the peace that passeth understanding. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of an unshakable knowing that you are more than your circumstances, more than your thoughts, more than your temporary emotional states. This is what it means to live as an awakened human being. Not perfect, not without challenges, but rooted in the recognition of your essential nature as consciousness itself, expressing through the unique vehicle of your personality and circumstances. Closing. The Christ consciousness isn't New Age because it isn't new at all. It's the perennial wisdom that shows up in every culture, every era, whenever human beings dive deep enough into the mystery of their own existence. Whether you approach it through the lens of psychology like Jung, through mystical practice like the Essenes, or through the direct teachings of Jesus stripped of their later theological interpretation, you're exploring the same fundamental truth. You are more than you think you are, and life is more meaningful than our surface-level culture suggests. The invitation is simple. Stop waiting for permission to explore the depths of your own consciousness. Stop outsourcing your spiritual authority to external institutions or teachers. The kingdom of heaven is within you, not as a belief to adopt, but as a reality to explore. Your life is the curriculum. Your relationships are the practice ground. Your daily challenges are the opportunities to embody love, wisdom, and compassion in real time. This is the original teaching, hidden in plain sight for those who have eyes to see. The question isn't whether you're ready for it. The question is whether you're willing to begin. The path is not easy, but it's simple. And it starts exactly where you are, with exactly what you have, in exactly this moment. What are you waiting for?